Second lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, the second chapter, starting with the 41st verse. Listen for the word of God. Now, every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. And then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him there. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And Jesus said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. May God add a blessing to this reading of the Word. When my son Levi was 5, we were down visiting my parents in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, at the same time that my brother, whose son I think was 10 or 11, were visiting, and my nephew David was very eager to go to Disney World. And as David spoke about Disney World, Levi got very excited about the possibility of going to Disney World, even though that had not actually been part of our plan. Because I thought that 5 was a little young for the first trip to Disney World. But the cat being out of the bag, I said fine. So my brother and I and our 2 sons went off to Disney World. And we actually had a marvelous time, and 5 was not the least bit too young, especially for Levi. We had a great time. But there was this moment, we were at that roller coaster that splashes down, I forget what that thing, Splash Mountain or something. Anyway, we were there. Levi was too short. He was not this tall. And so Cousin David went on it, and Levi and I were standing around in this huge crowd of people. And Levi wandered off to watch people come down the hill and splash at the bottom. So in a split second, I went from knowing exactly where Levi was to looking down and not seeing him anywhere. And I'm thinking, oh my God, he's been, and that was not using the Lord's name in vain, he's been stolen. The next 30 seconds seemed to me like 30 years. How many of you who have been parents and grandparents have had this experience? It was my first one. It was horrible. I thought, where in the world? What horrible thing has happened? Who has stolen this precious child of mine? And it was only 30 seconds later that I saw him 10 feet away, holding onto the fence and watching these cars come down the hill and splash into the water. My heart, it took weeks for my heart to slow down. Somehow I had Spirit-inspired wisdom not to bawl him out. Because frankly, he hadn't been being careless. He hadn't been being disobedient or rebellious in any way. He had just been drawn to the wonder of Disney World for a 5-year-old. It had sucked him away from me. Not very far away from me, and not for very long. So can you imagine what it must have been like for Mary and Joseph. Every year they make this trip with all of their relatives and all of their friends from Nazareth. They travel in a big caravan, and, kids will travel with their cousins or their next-door neighbors and play along the way, and you don't necessarily have your kids with you all the time on this trip, and they've done it before. Jesus is 12, for crying out loud. He's almost a man by Jewish reckoning. That would come a year later at his bar mitzvah. So they haven't seen him all this first day, but then, they arrive at the place where they're staying or camping or whatever it was that they did, and they're looking around. Comes supper time. Mary's got things going, and she says to Joseph, "Where's Jesus? I haven't seen him all day." And they look around and they ask their neighbors. Nope, haven't seen him. They ask the cousins. Nope, haven't seen him all day. Nobody has seen him. And so Joseph and Mary set out, making that probably at night a dangerous trip, but can you imagine what they're thinking? I mean, this is not the 21st century we're talking about. This is the first century. Children disappear just like they do now. There's slavery to be thought about. Who knows what could have happened to this child? They get back to Jerusalem, which is the nearest thing to New York City that they have, and they're looking for him everywhere. They're looking for him for 3 days. I was separated from Levi for 30 seconds, and I thought I was going to die. Can you imagine what it was like for Mary and Joseph? Can you imagine the stuff that was going through their minds? What a horror. And then on the third day, they find him. He's in the temple. And he's listening to all of the wise teachers who teach at the temple. It was sort of like an open-air university. There were rabbis from all over the place, and, you might have your favorite rabbi that you would go and listen to, or if you were in town for the festival, you might just kind of do a little smorgasbord going from one to the other. Well, Jesus has spent the last 3 days doing the rabbi smorgasbord. Amazing people with how much he understands, how much he knows. And, they say, what Luke tells us is that it was his questions that were amazing. And, questions are really way more illustrative of whether you're smart and wise or not than your answers are, really. Because it's the secret of wisdom is knowing the right questions to ask. And Jesus is amazing everyone. But Mary is astonished. Luke doesn't tell us what it is that Mary is astonished at, but I'm thinking it's not his theological acumen. I'm thinking she's astonished that this 12-year-old boy would do this thing to her, because that's the very next thing she said. Why have you done this to us? I don't want to suggest that Jesus has sinned or been disobedient or been rebellious or done something that he knows he ought not to have done, because it's part of our belief system that Jesus is sinless. That's the whole reason that his death and resurrection can have meaning for the rest of us. But here's the deal. He's like Levi at Disney World. This is Jesus, the Son of God. The temple in Jerusalem is the closest thing to Disney World for a person of his nature that you could come up with. Here is this entire smorgasbord of learned teachers. He didn't try to be disobedient. He didn't try to wander off. He was just sucked towards the learning, the wisdom, and the wonder of the temple. Maybe if he'd been 13 or 14, it would have entered his mind that if I'm here, I'm not there. If my mother and my father aren't here with me, I'm also not there with them. And even though I know where I am, maybe they don't know. Jesus is not sinful or disobedient, but he's 12. He's clueless. He's both at the same time very wise for a boy of 12, very learned. He has wonderful questions. He has an insightful mind, but he's 12. He's clueless about how his actions have affected others. The question, as a scholar myself, that comes to me when I start to deal with a story like this in Scripture is the question, why did Luke include this story? You might say, well, because it happened. Well, a lot of things happened between Jesus' birth and circumcision and the beginning of his ministry at about age 30. A lot of things happened there. And here's the deal. We have 4 writers of Gospels, and not one of them thinks that it's important to tell us anything that happened between those 2 events, his circumcision and the beginning of his ministry. The only story that we have is this account that we just read from Luke when he was 12. So why does Luke, of the 4, he's the only one who tells this story, and of all the stories that there were to tell, why this one? There's got to be a reason why Luke thinks we need to hear this story. When we hear this preached, we hear it preached to say, oh, isn't Jesus wonderful? Even when he was 12, he was very interested in the temple. And why are Mary and Joseph so clueless that they wouldn't know where he is? We sort of hear, there's always this assumption that because it's Jesus, whatever he does, it must be good. I think that Luke tells us this story for a very particular reason. And the clue to why Luke wants us to hear this story, he wants us to realize that at this one moment in Jesus' life, even though he was sinless, even though he was not being disobedient or disrespectful, at this moment, Jesus was a clueless 12-year-old boy. He was a wise, thoughtful, insightful young man on his way to being a talented rabbi, but in this moment, he was clueless. And the thing that makes me think that is that the last line in this that Luke tells us, and that is, well, there's 2 last lines. One is, and he returned with Mary and Joseph, and he was obedient to them. Okay? The rest of this story is that Jesus suddenly has a clue. He sees the look in his mother's face. He sees the dried grime on her face from the tears and the dust and the dirt, because she hasn't really been thinking about her beauty regimen in these last 3 days. He sees that. He gets it. He doesn't do this again. That's clue number 1. Clue number 2 is that Luke tells us, and Jesus grew in wisdom. And he grew in the favor of God and human beings. What this means is that when Jesus is born, he is not like instant Son of God. I mean, he is. In his being, in his essence, he is and always was the Son of God. But he has to grow. And he has to learn like every other human being. So while he might have been a remarkably obedient and helpful and cooperative 12-year-old, he was in fact a 12-year-old. And he had days when he was clueless. And this is one of them. But he grew in wisdom. That's what happens in those 10, 15, do the math, years between this moment and when he starts his earthly ministry, is that he's growing in wisdom. He is becoming fully the person that he was born to be. He's growing in wisdom. He's becoming less clueless day by day. Why does Luke want us to know that? Well, maybe he wants us, and I think this is true, he wants us to understand what it means to say that Jesus is the Son of God. Not that he was some kind of, baby grown-up when he was in the manger, that he knew everything that was going to happen to him when he was 3 years old, but rather that he grew into the person that God had brought him into the world to be. But the other reason I think that Luke wants us to see this is to understand that the nature of being a human being, the nature of being a faithful human being, is that we grow in wisdom and in knowledge. That we grow in the esteem of other human beings and even of God. All of us have the opportunity day by day, week by week, and at this time of year we think year by year, that we have the opportunity to grow in wisdom, to become more the people that God intended for us to be at the beginning of time. This is a time of year when that is on our minds. How have we failed in the year past, and how can we grow from that failure? Learn from that failure and be smarter and be wiser and be better and be kinder and be smarter than we were in the year just past. Jesus grew in wisdom and in knowledge, and so might we, and so must we. It might be good for us to ponder what are the things that either keep us from growing in wisdom or that help us to grow in wisdom. This time of year, at this moment in time, is usually the time traditionally when we do that. And it seems to me like there are a number of things that keep us from growing in wisdom. One of them is a refusal or an unwillingness or a fear of admitting that we have been clueless or dumb or stubborn. Because no change is possible unless you're willing to face the fact that you have not been what you ought to have been. Because it's humbling to have to look back at a year just past and say, I screwed up here and here and here. If we can't look at our failures, if we can't look at the wrongs that we have done, if we can't confess our sins and open ourselves up to the wisdom of God, if we can't risk being humiliated even in our own eyes, then we can't grow. Growing in wisdom requires acknowledging our foolishness. Another possibility that keeps us from making the changes from one year to the next is an unwillingness to listen to people, other people, who have different views, different ideas, different understandings, different beliefs. I spend time, as many of you do I know, on social media, on Facebook, and I noticed that all of my friends really, and I have about 150 on Facebook, they almost all agree with me, except some of my relatives who just tolerate me, you know? They all have the same political beliefs. They all pretty much have the same religious beliefs. We all have the same kind of background. And, that and then the people that I'm related to are the only people I'm friends with. Because, if you got people you disagree with, they're going to say disagreeable things. They're just going to make you mad. And why not just ignore all of that? And I think that, social media is not the only place where we do that. We segregate ourselves to people who look like us, people who think like us, people who've had the experiences that we've had. If we're not open to new things, new people, new ideas, when do we ever grow in wisdom? If we just hang out with people who think just like we do, how are we ever going to grow? How are they ever going to grow? So I've my New Year's resolution, I'm going to have more Republican friends on Facebook. And not just in church. That was a joke. That was a joke. Yikes. A third possibility for what it is that keeps us from growing in wisdom is just plain old fear. Because, we're comfortable doing the things we've always done, being in the places we've always been, and yet the place where we might learn something new, see something new, is in a new place. But that's scary. We might not know what to say. We might not know what to do. We might not know what's appropriate. We might look foolish or silly. Or we might get in a situation where we don't know how to get out or don't know how to take care of ourselves. So it's easier just to stay where we are, where we know everything that's supposed to happen and everything that, we're comfortable with. And so, we don't venture out. When I was a junior in college, I had the opportunity to go to Africa for a summer with a group called Operation Crossroads Africa. And it was a group where half the people were black and half the kids were white, half were men, half were women. Then we went to this African country. In my case, it was the Gambia. And then there were an equal number of African students our age and some a little older who worked with us on a development project. It was the most frightening thing I have ever done. I had never spent 9 weeks in close, and I mean close proximity to African American people, Americans who were not white, who had a different experience than mine. It was scary, and there was a lot of rubbing, a lot of friction, especially at first, that we had to learn how to get through. When we got to there were expectations that the African Americans had of what it was going to be like to interact with Africans, and they were totally disappointed. There were things that I expected and that I knew about what all people like and all people do and what all people think and all people experience, and I realized all people but didn't include all these Africans who had an entirely different cultural experience. I grew more from that experience. A lot of the African students were Muslims. We had the opportunity to share what our faith was about, which was cool. I've never been the same. It changed me in ways that I can't begin to tell you. Because I realized for the first time in my life that just because we always do things that way here in the United States, that's the way it always has to be done. No. It's just the way we do things here in the United States, which doesn't make it bad. It just means it's just the way we do it here. And there, they do things entirely different. And it's cool. I grew in wisdom, a kind of wisdom that has carried with me for 30 years. But I was scared to go. I was scared to go. It would have been so easy just to say, I'll work driving the truck for the florist again this summer and make some money. Jesus isn't the only one who grows in wisdom and in understanding to become the person that God intends for him to become. That's the way we all need to live if we're going to grow and blossom. We need to face our fears and move on. Open ourselves to the thing that the many things that God has for us, to change our minds, to help us to see things in new ways and different ways. Growing in wisdom is at the core and the center of what it means to be a faithful person. Being open to the things that other human beings bring into our lives, the things that God brings into our lives, the things that the creation brings into our lives, is a core aspect of the faithful life. And this time of the year is a wonderful time to think about that. How will you be different in 2013? How will you open yourselves to the growth in wisdom and understanding that God has for you that you've not been open in the past? How will things change and be different for you? Thanks be to God. Let us now bring before God our lives and the fruits of our lives. that they might be blessed and dedicated to God's service. Now might be a good time to put on your hats. Count down with me. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.